Sanjay, thank you. Thank you for coming in person for this Wavemaker Conversation.
Well, I really appreciate you inviting me, and it's good to see you in person.
It's so good to see you in person, and I have to say that one of the reasons I just wanted to start in this backyard surrounded by all these trees is not only have I read World War C, but I also took the opportunity to read your previous book, Keep Sharp. And there are so many connections between growing your brain stronger into old age that you've alerted me to that are connected to nature. And one of them is the Japanese forest bath. And I told my teenage daughter yesterday, we were walking among the trees, I said, have I told you about what Sanjay reported on the Japanese forest bath? She said, yes, Dad.
And she remembered, so it's good.
And she remembered.
The brain's working.
So tell me about the Japanese forest bath and the connection between nature and how your brain works.
Well, I am totally fascinated by this because I think there's things in life that you kind of know to be true, or they make you feel good for whatever reason, but you don't necessarily know why. And that's the sort of thing, like if I know the what of something, if I can understand the why of it, it's really going to stick. So Shinrin-yoku, which is what it's called, the Japanese term for forest bathing, is basically getting into the forest and breathing in the aroma of the forest. Breathing in the aroma of the forest. A lot of focus on breath, but what's particularly interesting about Shinrin-yoku though is this knowledge now among the Japanese that there's these chemicals that are being released into the air called phytoncides, phytonsides, and basically they are natural stress-busting chemicals that occur in nature to help, plants and other things overcome toxic stress. Well, turns out we humans have receptors for these phytoncides in our body. So fascinating. So you're breathing in the aroma of the forest and it feels good, smells good, but now you think, oh, now I'm breathing in these phytoncides. I got receptors for them. They bust stress in nature. They're busting stress in me. It's a beautiful, harmonious thing. And we have receptors for these things that occur in nature, which just gives you this sense to your question about how co-evolved we are and why, being in nature can be so helpful to our brain and every part of our body.
You're here primarily to talk about COVID, but of course, life more broadly, and what you've learned during COVID. So, this whole idea of things changing so quickly, how do you keep up with it?
You're reading all the time, and when you're dealing with something that's a novel disease like this, there is no textbook. So you're constantly reading and trying to integrate it into a foundation of knowledge, But I do think it's part of the why being so important. Again, if you understand the fundamentals of something, then you're constantly layering knowledge, as opposed to like each thing is a new thing, it's a siloed off piece of information. So, it's been my whole life for almost 2 years now. I mean, going to the hospital and studying the pandemic and my family and exercise. That's about it.
And exercise. So one question I want to ask you before we even really get going is, you've come to me, I'd say we're about 3 feet apart. Your team asked me in advance, am I fully vaccinated? I was fully vaccinated officially 5 months ago, was my second vaccine, so I'm fully vaccinated. And now we're walking without masks outside. And I've already learned from you very specific things about COVID and even the Delta variants, transmissibility outside versus inside.
Yep.
What's your basic protocol right now? I mean, would you walk with just about anybody this far apart?
I think so. I think if we were this far apart and there weren't other people sort of creating a plume of virus in the air, I'm less worried about it. I think it's not one of those things where you can say the risk is zero for anything. But I'm vaccinated, so I'm less likely to get sick, far less likely to get sick. You're far less likely to be putting any virus out, although not zero. If you are putting virus out, it is really getting dispersed very quickly here. You have a beautiful open space here. So I'm really not worried about that. Before Delta, I think you would have been hard pressed to find a single documented case of outdoor transmission. Delta did change that. It's just that much more contagious. But still, in this sort of situation, I'm not that worried about it.
Would you have gone to Music Midtown the other night?
I was invited to Music Midtown. I did not go.
Because?
Because of this. Too many people, too low a vaccination rate. I often use the metaphor of the weather. It's showering here in Atlanta. It's, sometimes people ask me, what would be the greatest innovation in this whole pandemic? I said, being able to see the virus. If you could see it, it would change everything. All of a sudden you see a plume of orange smoke coming at you. How people react would be very different, It's kind of like that scene from The Princess Bride. It's like, it's tasteless, it's odorless, iocane powder, right? It's the joke. He tastes it, that's the perfect poison. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, you don't know it's there until it's made you very sick or kill you. That's the virus.
Let's go and sit down, and then we're going to talk about some of these issues, including the underlying ways that you assess risk versus reward, because this is a big theme of yours. And I also want to talk to you about this word that keeps coming up in World War C. We call it the novel coronavirus, but I want to put a spotlight on that word novel because you, Sanjay Gupta, through your career, through your life, have dealt with so many novel situations. And I know this is a big theme for you in parenting, to raise resilient kids who can handle novel situations. So let's go inside, talk about your book, talk about assessing risk versus reward, and anything else that comes up.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
So Sanjay, first of all, I'm going to thank you again for coming to my home and this makeshift studio here to talk about, number one, just to see each other again.
Yeah.
To talk about your new book, World War C, and the subtitle's interesting, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic and How to Prepare for the Next One. So you're already thinking, this is not the last that we'll experience.
Yeah. I mean,
and why do you feel so strongly about that? Because you're an optimist.
Well, I think that a lot has been discussed lately about, where this virus came from, but that aside, it's pretty clear that human beings and the various other organisms on Earth are increasingly coming in contact. Part of it is just population expansion, obviously a lot of it's deforestation, but these jumps from animals to humans have always been happening. There's millions of jumps that are happening, and most of them are inconsequential. But if you start going from 1 million jumps to 10 million jumps, then you get the chance of one of these viruses being a problem. And so I think it's almost a certainty that we will see another pandemic in our lifetime. What I would say is we'll see for sure another emerging infectious disease. Whether or not it turns into a pandemic, that's on us. That's on us. We have the capacity, I think, as a human race to prevent that from happening. But if it doesn't, that's on us.
What makes you think that we really have the capacity to really execute the prevention of a pandemic, given your immersion in the past 18 months of this pandemic?
Well, I'll preface by saying many infectious disease doctors have told me that this wasn't even the black swan event. Like you think about a 1 in 100, 1 in a century pandemic, that black swan event, they're like, well, this wasn't even really it. This was actually fairly easily controllable, and it had a 0.5% mortality. 0.5% is terrible, but SARS was 10% mortality. Can you imagine if SARS had been contagious like SARS-CoV-2, like this virus? That's a black swan event. So what I mean is that I think those jumps are going to continue to happen, but the idea that it starts to sustain spread human to human in all these places around the world and becomes out of control, I think that's what we can control. Simple things. I mean, masks, distancing, things like that make a huge difference in the early days of the pandemic.
Our last email exchange had been January 9th, 2020, right before this was really a pandemic.
Wow.
And the email was for me to you saying, hey, that spinal surgeon you recommended, because we were afraid that our daughter might need spinal surgery.
Right, I remember.
She did not in the end, but you recommended a wonderful guy. And we had just learned that she doesn't need surgery. January 9th, 2020. I was researching the earliest cases because I know you have always been obsessed with the patient zeros in any epidemic outbreak. And here's what I found from the New England Journal of Medicine, reported on January 19th, 2020. a 35-year-old man presented to an urgent care clinic in Snohomish County, Washington, with a 4-day history of cough and subjective fever. He checked into the clinic, on and on. He had just returned. He disclosed that he had returned to Washington State on January 15th after traveling to visit family in Wuhan, China. The patient stated that he had seen a health alert from the CDC about the novel coronavirus outbreak in China, and because of his symptoms and recent travel, decided to see a healthcare provider. He was diagnosed as the first patient in the US. So in these past 18 months, since that man checked into that clinic, you have been immersed thoroughly in this story. What are the most important lessons that you want to raise up high for us so that we can then take that knowledge and maybe assess the evolving headlines as we move forward?
It's really interesting to hear you read that, because in some ways it seems like what you were describing was something that obviously I remember very well, but it felt like a decade ago. Time has been so warped here. And what's also warped about it is that we now know, even since that report of this 35-year-old man, that there were patients before him. So it's like time moved forward and time moved backwards as well when it comes to the pandemic. It's stretched. I think there's a lot of incredible lessons, I think, scientifically that we've learned. And sometimes our greatest scientific advancements come when our back's up against the wall. The mRNA vaccine, everyone talks about it, and I think most people recognize how significant a scientific development that was. People will win the Nobel Prize for this. I mean, it's remarkable. It took us to another level in terms of what we can do. But they've been tinkering around with it for a while, 15, 16 years. Doctor at UPenn actually was so interested in it, but lost her tenureship, or lost her academic track because of her interest in this. And she went off to work in the private sector, a little company known as BioNTech, which saved the world. I mean, and they've been doing this for a long time. So I guess it's a long way of saying that I think we're capable of far more than we realize. And for me in my own life, and I think for my friends and my family, I say, I don't want to have a pandemic to inspire you to do things. That's a hefty price to pay. But can you somehow harness the power of that pandemic and what it did to stimulate this energy and creativity? That was a big lesson for me. It's all bad. But what was it that we could take away from this and learn from? And that was a big one. I think another one was something that you talked about earlier, how human beings perceive risk. And it's been, like everything else in this pandemic, really politicized. 0.5% mortality, that's 1 in 200 people. You moron, aren't you going to take cover, be careful, protect yourself? And the other guy's going, I'm 99.5% good. What are you getting all bent out of shape about? Same objective data, totally different subjective interpretations.
And you actually went to one of my favorite authors, Maria Konnikova, who wrote The Biggest Bluff. For those who don't know her book, The Biggest Bluff, she didn't know how to play poker. She learned it from the master, won, I think, $100,000. She got to the World Series of Poker. She's sort of one of these experts at assessing risk and luck versus what's chance and what you can control. What did you learn from Maria Konnikova about how to decide what risk is really worth taking?
Can I pause for 1 second and say, should I put a coaster here? Because if I've learned anything from Larry David, it's, you got to respect the wood.
That is so nice. You know what? Oh my gosh.
I can put it on the ground.
There is one.
Is there a coaster?
No, we have a coaster.
You know what? Have you ever watched that episode? Do you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm?
That is so funny. You
got to respect the wood.
My wife, you know what? She's going to say, you can invite Sanjay back. That's really wonderful.
Well, I've been trained well, let's put it that way.
So Maria Konnikova, The Biggest Bluff, how do you assess risk?
She's a psychologist too, did you know that?
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of a perfect mix. I want to figure out who to talk to about risk. A psychologist, poker player, perfect. What I learned from Maria, and she's very adept at explaining this because I think she came to it in a really interesting way. She didn't know how to play poker. That fundamentally, poker is a game of uncertainty, much like life is. And the difference is that with poker, you're forced to bet on that uncertainty. That's just as a sort of top line, I thought that was intriguing enough to say, hey, let's sit down and chat. So what it was about betting on uncertainty. It's also, in a way, forces you to bet on your confidence in something. Part of it's uncertainty, but in a way, you're betting on the flip side of it. You're betting that you're right, even in the face of uncertainty. Now, we do this all the time in our life, but we don't really have to show it. You don't know how certain I am of something. I can tell you something and I could be 70% certain, but you might think I'm 100% certain, you know? What poker does, it levels the playing field. So all of a sudden you have to say, okay, I am this amount confident. Kant, who Maria actually quotes in her book, Immanuel Kant, and I'm talking pure reason sort of time period, maybe 1800s, writes of a story where he's basically seeing a doctor, which I thought really interesting, and the doctor tells him something about his malady. Here's what's ailing you, or whatever they said back then. And Kant wasn't so sure that the doctor was right. So Kant basically went through this process where he was asking the doctor to bet on it. Would you bet $10 on that? 100? A car? Your marriage? Your happiness? Like, how confident are you really? And I think that that's what Maria really sort of talks about in her book, The Biggest Bluff, but also this idea that if you, broadly speaking, beyond just poker, what it means in our lives. You asked me, would I be willing to go to Music Midtown, for example? How confident am I that I'd be okay if I went to Music Midtown, right? You get a binary answer. I chose not to go. But if you want to dig deep, you can dig deep into how people actually think about risk, and it's a fascinating area to explore.
So, this actually gets into the whole issue now of, we're entering the fall and the winter entertainment season. We want to go to the Nutcracker, we want to go to Broadway, we want to go to sports events. All of these major organizations and minor ones are instituting protocol now. And essentially, they're showing their hand. In a sense, you really want to show your hand. Here's what we are confident about, and here's what we are not confident about. So let me ask you, what kind of protocol would it take you, Sanjay Gupta, and your family to say, we feel comfortable enough with this to bet that this entertainment is not going to cause harm?
Well, I think it's the last couple sentences that you said in terms of how you framed this, right? Not going to cause harm. To who? To me? To my family? To society? And what I mean by that is that right now we're in the middle of a viral storm. We're trying to bring this pandemic to an end. And when I say end, I don't mean zero COVID. I mean a cohabitation with which we are now comfortable with this virus, like we are with other viruses, flu, other coronaviruses, things like that. Some will always argue we're cohabitating too easily. We should be more, make it less hospitable. Others may say, why are you making such a fuss? Just, we'll cohabitate, it's fine. People will get sick every now and then, that happens. Anyways, whenever we get to that steady state, I think at that point you can basically say, hey, look, I would be in a situation where if people were vaccinated around me, testing, if they could, that would be ideal, because I think testing probably isn't utilized enough. And if there was a lot of viral spread, then masking. But other than that, I don't think that I would really, I think once we get to that steady state, I think in many ways life will feel much more normal again.
Is it not enough right now for a theater to say, we're requiring proof of vaccination? If not proof of vaccination, then a COVID test from the past 72 hours, which a lot of organizations are doing, plus mandatory masking. Is that enough?
I would say so. I would say that sounds like enough. But the primary obligation, I guess, is what I'm saying, Michael, is to lower the viral spread. Anthony Fauci put a number on it. He said if we got below 10,000 cases per day in the country, that's a good number. That feels like now we got it under control. We got to 11,000 in June of this year. Last time we were below 10,000 was in March of 2020, and now we're over 150,000. So it's not a good time, is what I'm saying. You can create safe havens. I don't disagree with that. But don't be under the illusion that that's doing anything to benefit this pandemic. You're not. You're potentially still worsening it.
So as we're on this issue of how to get to steady state, how to limit that virus, there are a few big topics in the news right now which are going to be evolving quickly over the next few weeks. And so I'm looking for the whys here and the how you're going to figure things out. Booster shots.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just checked my card. It's been 5 months. They're talking about maybe 6 months, 8 months. How are you going to assess when my family and I could really use a booster shot now? I hope the Biden administration approves it for people our age. What are you going to need to learn?
Can I just say one thing about the previous thing real quick?
Yeah.
Just so I want to make sure I'm leaving with the right impression.
Yeah.
You asked me about going to a Broadway play or something like that.
Yeah.
I love that stuff. It does get back to the risk-reward thing. If it were my daughter's wedding or something like a big life event, I would do it. For other things, I think you can make perfectly safe environments, but the reward for me personally isn't enough. So I think you gotta evaluate both, and you gotta be honest about both. You know, not how big a deal is it. Booster shot's a really interesting story because I think it's a metaphor for a larger issue that's going on in our country, and that is the overall politicalization of science. I was surprised at how it was handled because the White House came out and basically said, we're going to be doing booster shots. 8 months after you got your vaccination, you'll be eligible for a booster shot. We're starting September 20th. Put a date on it. And by the way, we're going to wait for the FDA and CDC to weigh in on this as an afterthought. That's just not how you're supposed to do things. The scientific agencies are supposed to tell you that you can do this first, that it's scientifically valid, that there's rationale for it, and then the White House announces it. The White House made it seem like this was preordained, and it wasn't, because when the FDA scientists looked at the data, they came to a different conclusion than some of the folks at the White House had. For me personally, what I think is kind of amazing is that the vaccines work really well. It's sort of like the steady state argument again. If I were to get COVID, I probably would have a very mild case. And that's sort of the point. Would I take a booster so that I wouldn't have a couple days of sniffles and things like that? Probably not. I probably wouldn't. Not because I'm worried about the safety of the vaccine, and it's not even an equity issue. Like, oh, we should save these for other countries. We should, but that's not the rationale. For me, I think you take things if you need it. I'm not going to give everyone statin drugs either, just because I'm worried about cholesterol in America. I think you have to have a rationale. And so when you looked at the data, two things really jumped out. The people who were breaking through their vaccine, the breakthrough infections, so to speak, that were getting sick enough to be hospitalized, were really either mostly people over the age of 65 and people who had certain medical conditions. That was really primarily it. That's who was ending up in the hospital. It was very unlikely for someone like me, making my own decision to end up in the hospital. The Israelis' data that they used, which was very interesting because they're ahead of us in terms of vaccinations. They got 65% of the country vaccinated. They've been boosting since August. What was very interesting is they defined severe illness in Israel as a blood oxygenation below 94 and rapid breathing. That'd be somebody who'd be considered severely ill. That is not how we define severely ill in this country. We kind of made it almost synonymous with hospitalization. So we were looking at two totally different data sets and trying to say, oh, well, I mean, they have this degree of severe illness and it got this much better when they gave boosters. Well, people went from 94% oxygenation to 96 and that's like taking away the sniffles. So here's sort of the point. It's a hard story to tell on television and people may not understand it. At the end of the day, they just want to know what you would do, like you asked me, and I would say, when I put it all together, I don't think I need a booster. My parents, yes, but not me.
Yeah, but you just gave me the whys and the numbers behind the whys.
Yeah.
So now I can sort of figure it out. Are you seeing any sign that, I guess it's almost too early to tell, from the people you've spoken to, when does immunity start to wane significantly enough so that we should be concerned and recalculate our risk-reward calculation? Or do we not know yet? Do we not have enough information?
I don't think we know for sure, and I also think it depends on how you define wane. Breakthrough infections in and of themselves, I have found to be a poor metaphor for vaccine efficacy. And again, this is one of those whys, right? If you look at what happens in the body of someone who is vaccinated with this vaccine, it is creating essentially an army of protector cells around the lungs. Okay? It doesn't want this virus to get into the lungs, because once it gets in the lungs, that's when people get really sick. It doesn't provide as much protection, what is called mucosal protection, in the upper airway. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means if you're vaccinated and you're carrying virus in your upper airway, that's not at all surprising. Vaccinologists will say, well, yeah, of course that guy tests positive. That's not what the vaccine does. The vaccine protects it from getting in the lungs. So now we look at all these people who get breakthrough infections because they're getting tested, and they're saying, wow, breakthrough infection rates are X, and we need to boost. Breakthrough infections were always expected. It reveals sort of fundamental lack of understanding of what the vaccine really does. People think, I can't get infected anymore. Not the case. If you were to even swab during flu season, you'd find a lot of flu in people who are perfectly healthy, have no symptoms. So, you know, that's one thing you really have to remember about how you're assessing whether something's effective or not. And in Israel, again, 64% vaccinated, boosting since August. They have the highest case rates they've had at any point during this pandemic.
Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think because it's a very contagious virus is the fundamental reason. But the idea that even with vaccination and boosting, that it's going to prevent the upper airway from having, virus in it is not the way that the vaccine works. I do think that we're going to have a rapid decline of cases. If you look at what happened in the UK, for example, I think there will be a rapid decline.
You do think we're going to have a rapid decline? Just because
we've seen this in other countries, in the UK, and even though Israel now has more cases, they had a rapid decline as well. I think two things will happen. One is that I think we will get some sense of control over this virus, but I also think we're going to figure out the right things to measure to sort of give an idea of when we can return to those types of activities pretty safely. And I think it's just basically feeling like the hospitals are not going to become overwhelmed. You're not going to have high deaths. We have to figure out what we're comfortable with, what that steady state is. But I think that may happen, frankly, Michael, over the next couple of months. Guys like Gottlieb and others have been saying this is probably the last big surge of this. It's not that there won't be other surges. It's the last big surge, they think. I mean, could some variant be out there that is going to be so different that it's going to cause another surge? Perhaps, but I don't think they've seen that yet. They're past lambda in the Greek alphabet, so they've got a lot since delta all the way to lambda that they've been tracking. And so I'm optimistic in that regard. I think we will be in a place where the viral spread will come down to a controllable level, and we'll be able to do nutcracker and things like that.
So just to finish the hard news stuff, and then I want to get into I want to return to this idea of something novel, something big, and how do you deal with something novel? But just let's do the vaccines from 5 to 12. What do you need to know to conclude that these are good to go for 5 to 12-year-olds?
I think at the data that we've seen so far that has been released by the company only, that's all we've seen. If that gets validated, I think it's really good data. You have to take this in the context of there's been some 5 billion of these shots now given out around the world. And so I wouldn't have accepted this sort of data had that not been the case. But we know that as a general rule, this is a safe vaccine. It's been trialed now, and now you have 5 billion shots of real data out there.
That's such an important number, 5 billion shots of real data.
Yep.
So for some of the people who have hesitancy, because it's sort of new, but it's 5 billion shots.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's people who demand certain levels of evidence may always have those levels of evidence change based on how dug in they are on their position. But it's becoming increasingly challenging to really question the validity in terms of safety and efficacy of these vaccines. People will always say, well, where's the long-term data? Well, the only way you can get long-term data is long-term. So are you gonna wait 10 years to give a vaccine to get the long-term data? It's a ridiculous proposition, but people will raise it because you can always require more evidence to defend your position. But I think because it's got real world data and because they tested for safety in these kids and the kids seem to generate really good antibodies, I think it's a good vaccine. I would already, if I had kids that young, I don't anymore, but if I did, I would certainly recommend that they get it.
One of the things I came across in your book was an early mission statement that you had in life. Actually, just around the time you joined CNN, you said, "I wanted to tell the stories of the human spirit under the most challenging circumstances." I mean, this is basically among the most challenging circumstances. Is there a particular story that you can share from your reporting over the last 18 months that really tells the story of the human spirit under the most challenging circumstances?
There's been so many people who have risen up, I think, during this pandemic, and their stories don't get told enough, and in some ways are hard to tell. They're almost like you almost feel sometimes like maybe you're tainting it a bit by even telling it. Like it wasn't meant to be recalled. But I remember like early on, March or so of last year, I had to go to the grocery store for something, and the person in front of me took time to, as I was going to touch the knob, cleaned it off before I was to touch it. Now in the end, we now know this doesn't even really transfer by surfaces, but we didn't know that at the time. And I just remember thinking, we may be okay. We got actually decent people around who just like, that guy just cares. He didn't need to do that, but he for me, and because I was the next person to touch the door. I had friends of mine, many doctors who volunteered their time in the COVID units because the hospitals were so overwhelmed. And the doctors who were working the COVID units were exhausted, and burned out. So other doctors would come in who weren't on those units, who weren't infectious disease or pulmonologists, but coming in to basically, hey, how can I help? One of the guys I remember telling me, I just think about him all the time, he had a young baby at home. And so he was going to do work that he didn't have to do, and then he'd come home and sleep in the garage every night because he didn't want to sleep in the house. Those are incredible stories, I do think that the story, again, of this mRNA vaccine, and particularly Aslam Turechi and Uhar Sahin, the husband and wife team of BioNTech, it's an incredible story. They're living in Germany. They're Turkish. They fell in love in the lab, got married, spent their honeymoon back in the lab, working on this for their whole life, basically shoestringing it, riding a bike to work every day, just making it work. And when this pandemic happens, he and they both come together and they say, this is our moment. We're going to create something that's going to save the world. And they did it. That's a pretty remarkable story. And they're just incredible people. So, they're the kind of people who do right and do the right thing. They know how to, they have competence and they have intent. And I think it sometimes feels like a rare combination. So I think there's plenty of stories like that, of people who really rose up.
Let me ask you to tell a story from your personal experience, which I hadn't actually known until I read your book, Keep Sharp. And you shared this story, and it really has to do with how we approach novel situations. It's from back in 2003. I was at CNN with you at that time. I wasn't totally aware of what happened. You were in the Iraqi desert with the, was it called the Desert Docks?
The Devil Docks.
The Devil Docks
Yep.
of the Navy. A serviceman was shot in the head. You were the only neurosurgeon nearby. You did not have the proper equipment, but you figured out how to save his life. Tell us that story, because I really think that's so fascinating. And when I hear that story, I get so optimistic about potential.
Yeah. Well, me too. It's first of all, I was an embedded reporter, and as an embedded reporter, people see what you're putting out on TV, but you develop really strong relationships with the people you're with. You're embedded with them, so you spend a lot of nights just talking about your life and sports and marriages and whatever it may be, and you get to know each other. And also, when you're embedded in a military in a conflict situation, they're also kind of responsible for you to some extent. That was the whole embedding process, that it would allow reporters to be able to have some degree of safety traveling through these war-torn areas. Anyways, I was traveling with the Devil Docs. They're a group of doctors, nurses, corpsmen, people who basically hopscotch around the battlefield right behind whatever front line position they're covering, and take care of the wounded as soon as they are wounded, which is an incredible thing. In 91, during the Gulf War, there was no such thing. Medical capabilities were purely in Kuwait, in the Gulf, and then maybe transported to a different country even. So if somebody got injured in the battlefield, it took them a while to get back to any kind of standard of care. And people were dying in transport.
And I remember you reporting on the golden hour.
That's right.
That 1 hour
that 1 hour
after you're wounded.
So the Devil Docs were basically designed to try and target the golden hour, to take care of the patients within that hour. We get to know each other. They have general surgeons and orthopedic surgeons, and one day they come to me in the middle of this Shamel sandstorm, I still remember, and said, "Hey, would you take off your journalist cap, put on your surgeon's cap to take care of this Marine lieutenant who'd been shot in the head?" And they brought him in the field. They thought that he had actually died because they couldn't find a pulse, but it was chaos out there. It was real cacophony. They couldn't tell for sure. And then when they got back, they found a pulse, and that's when they came and got me. Gunshot wound to the head in the desert, but no particular tools in order to do the operation that I would do back here in the States. But what you really have to accomplish in those situations is you have to take the pressure off of the brain. That's what you have to do. The brain is the only organ in the body that is confined by something tough and hard, the skull. Every other organ can swell, the brain cannot. So you have to take the pressure off the brain. And we had no drill, except for the Black & Decker drill, which we've been using to put up the tent as we were hopscotching around the desert. So took the drill bit from that drill, put it in a sterilizing solution, wrapped the drill in these gloves, these sterile gloves. I had gloves on, I was gowned, I had a mask, hat, everything. And then I basically put the sterile bit on and used that drill then to basically remove a portion of Jesus' skull, to decompress his brain from the injury. Remove some bullet fragments, blood that had collected, and that was basically it. There was not much more that I could do for him, but it was the majority of the operation that he really needed. I was worried that he might get infected, and this may have been the most sort of MacGyver-esque thing that we actually did out there, which was like, so I need to put something on his brain to prevent it from getting infected, but there was nothing that was sterile that could stay there. And there was an IV bag that was hanging, and we looked at the IV bag and said the inside of that IV bag is perfectly sterile. So we took it, we dumped the IV bag in betadine, iodine solution, filleted it open, used the inside of that IV bag to recreate the outside of Jesus' brain. And then wrapped him up. Black Hawk helicopter lands, takes him away, and I don't know if I'm ever going to see him again. But that was a story. And I'll just tell you quick, I did see him again. Because I got a call one day. Did I tell you the story?
No, but I think you shared part of it in the book.
I shared part of this, but I don't know if I told this part. But I get a call one day. I'm back in Atlanta now.
Oh no, you didn't tell me this.
This is 5 or 6 months later, and it's 619 area code. I see the area code, and so I know that to be a San Diego area code. And I pick up the phone. I'm like, hello, and the guy says, oh, is this Dr. Gupta? I have an update on one of your patients. And I said, San Diego. I said, nah, I think you probably have the wrong Dr. Gupta. As it turns out, there's quite a few of us. Chuckle, 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 right? There are a lot of Indian doctors. But then he says, no, I think I got the right guy. Do you remember operating on Jesus Vidania over in Iraq? And I said, how does one forget operating on Jesus in the middle of the desert, right? And still have no idea how he did. Like, is he going to tell me that he didn't make it, or, And he says, oh, he's doing really well. He's got some left hand weakness, but other than that, he's doing great. If you're ever in Southern California, you should pop by and see him. And I was like, oh God, stomach, chest, just like felt powerful emotion. Like powerful emotion can hurt sometimes. It's so powerful, even if it's good. And but I was so happy. But I was going to be in Southern California, so I looked him up. Never seen him before except in the battlefield, right? And I go visit him, drive to his house, knock on the door, and he answers. Big strapping, Marine guy, just super nice guy. Come on in, send everything. We're talking. Young, right? Early 20s. Living with his mom and his dad and his brother. A little bit later, his mother comes out and she says, "Are you the guy that operated on my son?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And she takes my hands in her hands and she just holds them and she just says, "Thank you." It was very touching. A few minutes later, his dad comes out. Dads are different, right? His dad comes out, he goes, "You the guy that operated on my son?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He goes, "And you're a journalist?" I said, "Sir, I don't think you've heard the whole story." And we sat down and we talked. And I'll tell you something, Michael, part of the reason I really enjoyed these conversations is because I realized something even back then. This is 2003 time frame. They had never talked about it as a family. They went through this incredible thing, but they never talked about it because they went to Germany, then they went to Walter Reed, they were with Jesus, they brought him home, and life goes on. And you're back at it. And so I was sitting there realizing that I was in a way nurturing a conversation that otherwise would not be had. And his dad, who's a stoic guy, I mean, they're a two-job kind of guy, making ends meet, but facing the real struggles of life. You can tell he's got. And he says, "Yeah, we never talked about it, And I said, "Well, what are you thinking now?" He goes, "What I think now is that when Jesus went off to war, he basically said to me, 'I'll probably be back in a couple weeks, Dad. Don't worry about this.'" Because there had been this ups and downs in Iraq at that point. They had been deployed, they came back, deployed, came in. He thought I'd be back in a couple weeks. He says, "Dad, don't worry about me." That's the last thing Jesus said to me. He said, "The only thing you should worry is if, and it's not going to happen, but if a car pulls up and two guys get out, then you worry." He goes, "So one day I'm at home, getting ready early, like 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, getting ready to go to work. The storm door to our house is open, but the screen door is shut. And I see a car pull up and two guys in uniforms get out. And they walk up to the front door. And I'm standing there, they can see me, and I can see them. There's just a screen door, and they're knocking like, "Sir, sir." I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't, and then finally his mother came and answered the door and let the guys in. They said he's alive, but he's been badly wounded. That's when they first found out. I was like, I can't believe you guys have never talked about this. And I can't, there's such deep, profound understanding. And I could tell Jesus, even listening to his father speak about this from his father's perspective for the first time, was very emotional. He was very touched by it. I don't think he'd ever seen his father in that light. So, it was a great ending in the sense that this beautiful family experience. Jesus is now married, has kids. We trade pictures all the time. I had to give a commencement at USC, University of Southern California Medical School. And I wouldn't normally do this, but I decided, this is like 2008, 2009, I said, I'm going to invite Jesus. He lives right here. I'll invite Jesus, So I was giving my speech and kind of riffing a little bit, telling some stories, kind of having some fun, as you often do at a med school graduation, just, I've been through what you've been through, let me tell you what life's going to be like, sort of stuff. And I said, by the way, and I told a little bit of this story. But I didn't tell them how it ended. And I said, so they were wondering, did he survive? Did he not survive? And I said, everybody, meet Jesus Vidania. And he stands up, and the place just erupts, right? Med students standing on their chairs, trying to get a glimpse of this guy, clapping. It was beautiful. And I just said, hey, that feeling that you get right there, you've just entered a profession where you get to do that all the time. So, have at it. And it was his intersection with my life has been started with such tragedy, but has taught me so much.
It brings me back to a story you told about how you got interested in medicine in high school when your maternal grandfather had a stroke, and you watched these doctors care so much, and they saved his life. And
Yeah.
you said, wow.
Yeah.
I remember you telling me that,
Yeah.
and wow, it came full circle, well, many times full circle, right?
Absolutely. I mean, those, you never know like what experience you had.
But that idea, there's so much in that story. I'm so glad you told me the whole thing.
People often want to know the first part, right? But I think, you know,
Oh.
for someone who's as curious as yourself and also so interested in the human condition.
So let me ask you, as you've been through so much, I mean, that Iraq story was just one story of so many. You've covered so many disasters, wars. Now you've covered this, and yet you are still hopeful. You are a hopeful person. And it sounds like you feel like, do you feel like you are sending your daughters out into a hopeful world? And if so, how are you communicating that to them? And actually, let me ask you even more specifically. You said in your book, you said you spent more time with your family during this pandemic than the previous 10 years. Let me just ask you, what have you learned about parenting during the pandemic?
I think most fundamentally, I realize that I like it. I mean, I think it sounds a bit glib to say, but I mean, it's not like I really had a lot of experience with parenting until I became a parent. I assumed that I would like it, but there's a lot more about being a parent than anybody ever will tell you, you know, and that you can imagine until you're actually doing it. So I really like being a dad, you know. So that was a good thing, you know. You hate to talk about the pandemic in any kind of euphemistic way, but there were some silver linings, and I think that was one of them. I sort of found that we, you know, even though my kids are young, we sort of fundamentally share the same values, the same sorts of things bother us, the same sorts of things we find joy with. Sometimes it's like really specific things, like a type of music or a piece of art. Like, wait, you like that? I like that. How do you like? You know? But other times it's just that, you know, hearing a story and reacting to a particular part of the story the same way, you know. Maybe not even the most important part of the story, but a part of the story, you know, that sort of stuff. I also found, to be just perfectly honest, it's hard. It's tough being a dad, you know. It's not easy. I don't always know what the girls want from me. Sometimes they don't want anything. And
you said something interesting in your book. You said your wife had confided to you that sometimes the girls don't come to you with their problems because
I always try and fix it. And they don't want it to be fixed. The fixing for them is just to be heard. You know, that's all they want. But I think, you know, I'm not good at that, and I think that I'm not sure that I've gotten better, but I don't think I'll ever be great at it.
I want to ask you something else, and away from COVID and towards this really long-term obsession you've had with exercise and how it builds the brain. And we spoke about it a little bit when we spoke years ago for our first Wavemaker Conversation. And that you keep on learning more and more, and you incorporated it a lot into your book, Keep Sharp. But it also plays into, I mean, the whole second half of your book on COVID is about optimizing your health. So you're a very holistic guy. Tell us what you've learned recently about just how important exercise is in terms of building your brain, not just into middle age, but well into old age.
Exercise is probably the most evidence-based way to actually create new brain cells. Neurogenesis, something that most people, even up to 10, 20 years ago, did not think was possible in the healthy brain, to actually continue to build new brain cells. They believed what I guess our parents told us, you know, you get a certain number of brain cells, you drain the cache, and then you're done. Alcohol speeds up the decline, you know, all these other things speed up the decline. That's what we were taught. And it's not to say that those things may or may not be true. There's certain things that are quite destructive to your brain. But you can build new brain cells at any age, and exercise, movement, I should say more specifically, is probably the most evidence-based way to do it. There's lots of different things that do it, but it has such compelling evidence behind it. And what I found most interesting, just because I think most people sort of understand the basic value of exercise, is that they often say what is good for the heart is good for the brain. But when it comes to movement, there are some differences. Brisk walking, for example, was found to be the best way to release this compound known as BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's the miracle grow stuff for the brain. Not my language. A very prominent neuroscientist described it that way to me. I'm like, what does this BDNF do? It's miracle grow for the brain. Wow, I want that. How do I get it? You can't inject it, you can't swallow it, you can't eat it. Best way to get it? Brisk walking.
Not even running.
Not even running, and here's why. It's not that you're not making BDNF when you run. The problem, and there's plenty of literature now, but the problem is that you also generate a lot of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and it tends to block the effects of BDNF. So you get both, but they counterbalance each other. So running is great in so many ways, cardiovascular health and all these things. But if you want to find the best activity for the brain, it's probably a brisk walk. That's a little bit, again, of the why of things. But
so we've just created something new here. Well, let's bring it back full circle to the beginning.
Yeah.
The Japanese forest bathing. If you were to walk briskly in a forest, you've got it made.
I think that's probably one of the healthiest things you can do for yourself.
I called your former producer, David Martin. I said, any questions for Sanjay? How do you promote public health in a situation like this when people don't trust the people they should be trusting? Have you been able to take a skeptic in a conversation and sort of convince them of the right thing to do, and how did you do that?
You know, I had this guy, I'll tell you really quickly. It's the most amazing story. Our air conditioning was not working at the house. Hot. Finally get an air conditioning guy out to fix it. Comes a nice guy, probably in his mid-70s, wearing a mask, N95 mask, goes and fixes it. A very soft-spoken guy, very nice, fixes it, and he's walking out of the house now. And as he's walking out, he says to me, do you mind if I ask you a question? And he knows who I am. I didn't know if he knew who I was, but apparently he knew who I was. And he says, should I take the vaccine? It's about 2 weeks ago, right? And I said, yeah, you should take the vaccine. I mean, I really see no reason why not. There were some concerns about allergies, you know, but for the vast majority of people, absolutely. And he goes, oh, okay. He goes, the reason I ask is because I got a stent that was put in my leg last year, a couple of years ago, and they said, you know, got to worry about blood clots. And I heard that there was something about the vaccine and blood clots. So I wasn't sure whether to take it or not. And I said, oh, well, in fact, there had been some news about blood clots with these vaccines, but it was mostly with this one vaccine. It was very rare, 10 in a million, you know, 1 in 100,000 type situation, mostly postmenopausal women. I was telling him all this. And he's like, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. He goes, you know, my daughter died last week of COVID. And she was not vaccinated, and she said to me, before she went on the ventilator, she said, promise me you'll get vaccinated. And I want to get vaccinated, but I was worried about these clots, and I've been calling my doctor, and my doctor never called me back, so you're the first person I saw, and I'm asking you, should I get the vaccine? So I think it's really challenging to present people who haven't taken the vaccine as this monolithic, sort of resistant bunch who is doing this to spite the vaccinated, to wear their politics on their sleeve, whatever you want to call it. Maybe there are many people who are like that, but not all of them. So this guy hopefully has now been vaccinated and has a much higher chance of surviving now what we're going through than he otherwise would have.
This was just 2 weeks ago.
Just 2 weeks ago.
Sanjay, thank you so much for joining me in my screened-in porch with a lot of airflow,
Yes.
6 feet apart, fully vaccinated. You know what I'm going to do? Let me get my phone, because we did this last time, and I'm going to put you on the spot, but you're so good at this. I'm going to hit a video, and in 60
Hydration, key to life.
hydration. Sanjay, in 60 seconds. So if we had to write this story, you know, what did we just accomplish? What's the headline? What did we accomplish in this Wavemaker conversation with Sanjay Gupta?
I think what we accomplished today was we were able to have a conversation that wasn't driven by any kind of particular goal. It wasn't just an exchange of information, it was to actually add to the knowledge tree. I think that, you know, evolutionarily, we'll spend a lot of time sort of exchanging information, making things work, keeping the trains running on time. But I think where we suddenly take off as a species is when we have conversations like this, and something new may come of it, something unexpected, something surprising, something you hadn't thought of, and that'd be the point. Take a lot of shots, and this conversation is one of them.